In the small town of Oakridge, Eleanor Webb stands alone at her classroom window, watching the last yellow bus disappear around the corner. 23 years of teaching, and still her father's words echo. A waste of potential. Her mother's disappointed sighs. Her brother's sneers about her modest income. While her siblings pursued lucrative careers, Eleanor chose to nurture young minds instead of her bank account. Tonight, a plain white envelope sits on her desk. Another student's letter, this one from Thomas Parker, the troubled boy everyone had given up on. His words would soon spark a chain reaction throughout the community, revealing the invisible threads of influence she'd woven for decades. Could a single student's gratitude finally prove her worth to those who should have valued her all along? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Webb arrived at Oakridge High School at precisely 6:45 a.m., as she had every weekday for the past 23 years. The worn leather teacher's planner tucked under her arm contained not just lesson plans, but personal notes about each of her students, their strengths, struggles, and potential. The empty hallways welcomed her with familiar echoes as she made her way to room 217. This early morning solitude was sacred, a time to prepare both her classroom and her mind before the day's challenges. As she arranged the day's handouts, Eleanor's mind drifted to the day 25 years ago when she'd announced to her family her decision to change her major from pre-law to education. Her father's face had hardened instantly. "Teachers are a dime a dozen, Eleanor," he'd said, not bothering to mask his disappointment. "You could have been exceptional." Her brother Richard, already in his second year of law school, had smirked. Her sister Catherine, applying to medical schools, had looked genuinely confused, as if Eleanor had announced plans to become a professional balloon animal artist. "Morning, Eleanor," came a voice from the doorway. Principal Diane Harrison stood there, coffee in hand. In her 15 years as principal, she'd never lost her teacher's instinct for noticing details. "You're looking thoughtful today." "Just planning," Eleanor replied, gesturing to her open planner. "Any progress with Thomas Parker?" Diane asked. Eleanor sighed. 3 days absent now. I've called twice. If anyone can reach him, it's you," Diane said, her confidence genuine. Unlike Eleanor's family, Diane had always recognized her gift for connecting with struggling students. Later that morning, Eleanor watched her first period literature class file in. Her gaze lingered on Thomas Parker's empty desk. The boy had shown such promise at the start of the term, insightful comments about Steinbeck, a thoughtful analysis of symbolism in The Pearl. Then, 3 weeks ago, something had changed. His attendance became spotty, his participation minimal. "Today we're discussing resilience in To Kill a Mockingbird," Eleanor announced, hoping the theme might reach Thomas if he returned. She'd seen too many bright minds slip away when life's challenges overwhelmed them. In the faculty lounge at lunch, Eleanor encountered Sam Winters, the science teacher counting down the days to retirement. "Still fretting over the Parker kid?" he asked, noticing her distracted expression. "Some students just aren't worth the heartache, Webb. Learned that my first year. Every student is worth the heartache, Sam," Eleanor replied quietly. Sam shrugged. 29 years teaching and you know what I've learned? Kids like Thomas Parker, they're already decided. Nothing we do changes that." Eleanor disagreed but stayed silent. She'd had this argument with Sam, and with her family, too many times. That evening, Eleanor unlocked the door to her modest apartment. The space was small but warm, walls adorned with framed student artwork and shelves lined with thank you cards collected over decades. She'd never needed much space or luxury, despite her family's insistence that she should aspire to more. She checked her phone, a reminder about Sunday dinner at her parents' house. Eleanor sighed. These weekly gatherings had become exercises in endurance, each one a fresh reminder of how little her family valued her life's work. But she kept going, holding on to hope that someday they might understand. As she prepared a simple dinner, Eleanor thought about Thomas Parker again. She'd seen the potential in him that others missed. His perceptive comments in class discussions, the depth in his writing assignments. Something was holding him back, and she was determined to discover what. Eleanor opened her teacher's planner and made another note beside Thomas's name. Call home again tomorrow. Offer extra help. 23 years, and she still believed that reaching just one student could make all the difference, even if her family thought her career was meaningless. It was this conviction that kept her going, despite everything. The following afternoon found Eleanor alone in her classroom, the fading light of day casting long shadows across student desks. A stack of essays demanded her attention. Junior year reflections on courage in To Kill a Mockingbird. She'd stayed late specifically to grade them, knowing her weekend would be consumed by preparation for Sunday's family dinner. Eleanor reached for her red pen, then paused at a soft knock on the open door. Mr. Reynolds, the school janitor for over 30 years, stood in the doorway, a white envelope in his weathered hand. Found this at the front desk, Ms. Webb. Has your name on it. His voice carried the gentle drawl of a lifetime spent in Oakridge. Thank you, Carl. Eleanor accepted the envelope, immediately recognizing the handwriting. Thomas Parker. Her heart quickened slightly as Mr. Reynolds nodded and continued down the hallway, the rhythmic squeak of his cleaning cart fading into the distance. Eleanor studied the envelope. Thomas had been absent for 3 consecutive days now. Was this a formal withdrawal notice? A hastily scribbled excuse? She'd seen too many promising students disappear without warning over the years. She slid her finger beneath the flap and carefully opened it, removing a single sheet of notebook paper filled with neat, deliberate handwriting. Far neater than what Thomas typically turned in for assignments. This had been written with care. Dear Ms. Webb, it began. Eleanor took a deep breath and read on. I'm sorry for missing class. I know you've called home and I wanted to explain. Things have been really bad lately. Dad lost his job again and Mom's been working double shifts. The fighting got worse and sometimes it's just easier not to be home. But then I don't get much sleep and can't focus at school. I almost dropped out last week. Had it all planned. But then I kept thinking about our discussions in class, about Scout and Jem and how they face their challenges, about resilience and finding purpose even when everything seems stacked against you. You're the only teacher who ever really saw me. Not just as another student to process through the system, but as a person. When you asked about my analysis of Atticus Finch's moral courage, you listened like my answer mattered. When I was falling behind, you offered help instead of just marking me down. I remembered what you said about education being the one thing nobody can take away from you once you have it. That really stuck with me. So I'm not dropping out. I'm going to finish high school. Maybe even go to college someday. I just needed a few days to figure some things out, but I'll be back on Monday. Thank you for being the kind of teacher who makes a difference. Sincerely, Thomas Parker. Eleanor read the letter twice more, her vision blurring slightly. In 23 years of teaching, she'd received thank you notes before, usually prompted by parents at year's end or hastily scrawled on the back of homework assignments. But this was different. This was raw and honest and completely unprompted. She carefully folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. Thomas had been on the verge of dropping out, another statistic, another failure in the system. And something she'd said had reached him. Not a grand gesture or extraordinary effort, but simply doing what she did every day, treating her students with respect and genuine interest. Eleanor sat motionless at her desk, the stack of ungraded essays temporarily forgotten. A single student had just validated her entire career in a way her family never had. While they measured success in billable hours and surgical procedures and executive promotions, this letter represented what truly mattered to her: the quiet, often invisible impact of daily dedication. She thought about sharing the letter with her family at Sunday dinner. Would they finally understand? Or would Richard make some comment about nice sentiment but not exactly law school material? Would Catherine somehow relate it back to her own accomplishments? Would her father nod distractedly before changing the subject to something he deemed more significant? Eleanor slipped the letter into her planner. No, this was too precious to risk having it diminished. Thomas's words were for her alone, a reminder that she had made the right choice all those years ago, regardless of what her family thought. As she finally turned her attention back to the essays, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow, she would call Thomas's home again. Perhaps she could arrange some extra help sessions, create a more flexible deadline structure for his assignments. If his home life was as turbulent as the letter suggested, school needed to be a place of stability and encouragement. The red pen moved across the first essay with fresh energy. By the time Eleanor finally packed up her materials 3 hours later, the entire stack had been graded with thoughtful comments. Her back ached from sitting too long, and the school had grown completely silent around her, but a certain lightness had settled in her chest. Thomas Parker would be back on Monday, and that was enough for now. Monday morning arrived with a gentle spring rain, droplets racing down the classroom windows as Eleanor glanced repeatedly at the door. The first bell had rung 5 minutes ago, and students were settling into their seats, but Thomas Parker's desk remained empty. Eleanor tried to quell her disappointment. Perhaps his return would take more time, despite what his letter had promised. She was halfway through taking attendance when Thomas slipped in, his hair damp from the rain, his expression cautious but determined. Their eyes met briefly as he took his seat, and Eleanor gave him a small nod, continuing with the roll call as if nothing unusual had happened. No need to draw attention to his return. After assigning the day's reading group work, Eleanor circulated through the classroom, eventually making her way to Thomas's desk. "I got your letter," she said quietly as other students discussed the text. "Thank you for sharing that with me." Thomas nodded, eyes fixed on his book. "Thanks for not giving up on me." "Never," Eleanor replied simply, then added, "If you'd like to talk more about making up the work you've missed, I'm available during lunch period." "I'll be there," Thomas said, his voice steadier than before. The faculty meeting that afternoon was typical of mid-semester gatherings. Budget concerns, standardized testing schedules, and reminders about upcoming events. Eleanor sat with her coffee-stained agenda, making occasional notes while Principal Harrison reviewed district policies on attendance intervention. "Before we adjourn," Harrison said, "I'd like to discuss student retention strategies. Our dropout rate has remained steady, but steady isn't good enough. Any suggestions for more effective approaches?" Several teachers offered the usual recommendations: stricter consequences, parent contracts, rewards for perfect attendance. Eleanor listened quietly until Sam Winters spoke up. "Look, some kids just aren't cut out for school. We can't save them all." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "We're educators, not miracle workers." Eleanor found herself speaking before she'd fully formed her thoughts. "I respectfully disagree, Sam. Sometimes all it takes is making a genuine connection with a student." She hesitated, then continued. "These aren't just attendance statistics. They're individuals with complex lives outside our classrooms." Sam rolled his eyes. "Nice sentiment, Eleanor, but hardly practical with 30 students per class and curriculum requirements breathing down our necks." "It doesn't have to be elaborate," Eleanor persisted. "Simple things make a difference. Learning what interests them, connecting course material to their lives, treating their thoughts with respect, just showing them someone notices when they're absent." Several teachers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Eleanor rarely spoke so passionately at meetings, and her implied criticism of their disengagement hung in the air. Harrison watched the exchange with interest. "Eleanor, would you be willing to stay a moment after the meeting? I'd like to hear more about your approach." When the other teachers had filed out, Harrison closed the door and turned to Eleanor with an appraising look. "That was quite the impassioned speech. Any particular student on your mind?" Eleanor hesitated. "Thomas Parker has been struggling with attendance. We've had some breakthrough communications recently." "Interesting you should mention Thomas," Harrison said, leaning against her desk. "His mother called this morning. She specifically requested that regardless of his makeup schedule, he remains in your literature class. She mentioned he's suddenly talking about books at home, connecting their themes to his own situation." She tilted her head. "Care to share what magic you're working?" Eleanor felt warmth rise to her cheeks. No magic, just treating him like his thoughts matter. Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. His mother said he was determined to come to school today, despite some difficult circumstances at home. Harrison studied Eleanor thoughtfully. Have you ever considered developing a more formal mentorship approach? Something we could potentially implement across departments? I haven't thought about formalizing it, Eleanor admitted. Perhaps you should. Harrison handed her a blank notebook. Jot down your methods, specific strategies, approaches, the questions you ask. We could discuss creating a pilot program. Eleanor accepted the notebook with surprise. After 23 years of teaching her way with little recognition, this sudden interest was unexpected. That evening, Eleanor called Thomas's home and spoke with his mother, a tired-sounding woman who expressed genuine gratitude for Eleanor's interest in her son. He's never connected with a teacher before, Mrs. Parker said. Whatever you're doing, please don't stop. He actually talked about school at dinner last night. Something about Scout and Jem facing hard times with courage. She paused. Things haven't been easy for him, for any of us. I understand, Eleanor said gently. I'd like to work with Thomas on a modified schedule to help him catch up without feeling overwhelmed. Would that be all right with you? That would be... Mrs. Parker's voice caught slightly. That would be wonderful. As Eleanor hung up the phone, she noticed her own reflection in the darkened window. The same face. The same person she'd always been. Yet somehow, the simple act of receiving Thomas's letter had set something in motion that was already rippling outward in ways she couldn't have anticipated. She opened Harrison's notebook and began to write. Sunday arrived with unwelcome swiftness. Eleanor stood on her parents' doorstep, a homemade apple pie balanced in one hand while she rang the bell with the other. These weekly family dinners had evolved from childhood tradition to obligation, yet she continued attending with stubborn hope that something might eventually change. Martha Webb opened the door, her silver hair perfectly styled, pearl earrings. Catching the afternoon light, Eleanor, dear, right on time. She accepted the pie with a practiced smile. Although you know I have dessert prepared, you needn't have bothered. I know, Mom. I wanted to. Eleanor stepped inside the immaculately kept colonial home where she'd grown up. Family photos lined the entryway. Catherine in her white coat at medical school graduation. Richard in front of his law firm's imposing glass building. Her father receiving business leadership awards. Eleanor's college graduation photo was there, too, smaller and partially hidden behind a decorative vase. In the living room, her father Jeremiah sat in his leather armchair, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed what appeared to be financial statements. At 72, he remained as imposing as when he'd been an active CEO. His posture military straight, his gaze calculating. "Hello, Dad," Eleanor said. He glanced up briefly. "Eleanor, your brother called. He'll be late. Important client meeting. Catherine's already here." Of course Richard would be late. Important client meetings always seemed to coincide with family gatherings, emphasizing his indispensability to his firm. Eleanor headed toward the kitchen, where she found her sister, arranging a vegetable platter. "Need help?" Eleanor asked, washing her hands at the sink. Catherine, 3 years younger than Eleanor but somehow always seeming older, shrugged. "Nearly done. Mom's been cooking all day." She lowered her voice. "Fair warning. She'll probably mention Mrs. Henderson's son again." Eleanor winced. Mrs. Henderson's son, a divorced dermatologist in his 50s, had become her mother's not-so-subtle suggestion for Eleanor's spinsterhood solution. "Joy," Eleanor murmured, picking up serving spoons to set the table. By the time Richard arrived, 40 minutes late and still answering emails on his phone, the tension of forced pleasantries had Eleanor's shoulders aching. They sat around the dining table, a massive cherry wood heirloom that had witnessed decades of family dynamics. "Before we begin," Richard announced, finally pocketing his phone, "I have some news." He paused dramatically, waiting until all eyes were on him. "The firm is making me partner." Exclamations of delight erupted from their parents. Martha clasped her hands together in obvious pride while Jeremiah nodded approvingly. "That's my boy," he said, raising his wine glass. Always knew. You had it in you. Congratulations, Eleanor said sincerely. Whatever her frustrations with her brother, she didn't begrudge him his success. Yes, well done, Catherine added, though Eleanor detected a hint of competitive edge in her voice. I suppose I should share my news too. I've been selected to pioneer a new surgical technique at the hospital. Only 5 surgeons in the country were chosen for the training program. More exclamations, more toasts. Eleanor felt the familiar sinking feeling. Not jealousy exactly, but the certainty of what would follow. Both are children at the top of their fields, Martha beamed, serving the roast beef. We're so blessed. Both our children. The exclusion wasn't even intentional anymore. It was habitual. Eleanor was the teacher, the career that didn't merit mention in the family's highlight reel. Eleanor, dear, how are things at the school? Her mother asked, as if suddenly remembering her eldest child had a job too. Actually, Did I mention, Richard interrupted, that the partnership comes with a substantial raise? I'm looking at summer homes on the coast. How wonderful, Martha replied, attention immediately diverted. You know your father and I always loved Cape Cod. Eleanor cut her roast beef into precise pieces, swallowing her words along with her dinner. She'd been about to mention Thomas's letter, the breakthrough with his mother, Principal Harrison's interest in her teaching methods. But what was the point? In this room, helping a struggling student stay in school couldn't compete with partnership announcements and surgical innovations. Eleanor, I noticed your car was making that awful noise again when you pulled up, Richard said during dessert. You really should replace that thing. It's what, 12 years old now? It runs fine, Eleanor replied. Just needs a minor repair. On a teacher's salary. I suppose even minor repairs require budgeting, he said with what he probably thought was sympathetic understanding. If you need help? I don't need help, Richard, Eleanor cut him off, a rare edge in her voice. I manage my finances quite well. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Offering money was Richard's way of showing concern, but it always came wrapped in condescension. Your brother's just trying to help, her father said, his tone carrying a warning. No need to get defensive, Eleanor set her fork down carefully. I'm not being defensive. I'm simply stating that I'm financially independent. Of course you are, dear, her mother said soothingly, clearly trying to diffuse the tension. Though you know, Janet Henderson mentioned her son David is doing very well with his dermatology practice. He's just bought a lovely home in Westbridge. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Mom, I'm not interested in Janet Henderson's son. I'm just saying, it's never too late to what? Eleanor asked quietly. To abandon my career and find fulfillment through someone else's success? Martha looked genuinely startled. That's not what I meant at all. But it was. It always had been. The unspoken family belief that teaching was Eleanor's consolation prize. Not a real career, but something to occupy her until a more acceptable life path materialized. As coffee was served, Eleanor realized she'd said perhaps 10 sentences all evening. Her family's conversation flowed around her like a river around a stone, occasionally acknowledging her presence but fundamentally unaffected by it. Driving home later, Eleanor found herself thinking about Thomas Parker's letter, tucked safely in her bedside drawer. In those few handwritten paragraphs, she'd felt more truly seen than in decades of family dinners. Monday morning brought a welcome distraction from family dinner afterthoughts. Eleanor arrived at her classroom to find Thomas Parker already waiting outside the door, a full 30 minutes before first period. Good morning, she said, unlocking the room. You're early. Thomas shifted his backpack from one shoulder to the other. Wanted to get a head start on the makeup work. Eleanor nodded, understanding the unspoken reality. Likely easier to be at school than at home. Come in. We can go through what you've missed. The classroom was quiet in the early morning light, the hallways still empty of the usual teenage commotion. Eleanor pulled up a chair beside her desk as Thomas removed a dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird from his backpack. The book was clearly secondhand, its spine cracked and pages annotated by previous students. "I read the chapters you assigned while I was away," Thomas said. "About the trial. What did you think?" Eleanor asked, watching as Thomas carefully opened the book to a page marked with a gas station receipt. "Atticus knew he couldn't win," Thomas said slowly. "But he defended Tom Robinson anyway. He did what was right, even when everyone else thought it was pointless." He looked up, meeting Eleanor's eyes directly for perhaps the first time. That takes real courage. Eleanor felt a small surge of pride. Thomas hadn't just read the assignment, he'd connected with it on a deeper level. "Sometimes," she said, carefully, "the most important battles are the ones we fight, knowing we might not win." Thomas nodded, understanding passing between them. "Is that why you became a teacher? Even when people think it's not important?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. Had her family's dismissal of her career become so internalized that it showed to her students? Or was Thomas simply more perceptive than most? "I became a teacher because I believe that helping young people discover their own voices is one of the most important things anyone can do," she answered truthfully, "whether others see that value or not." Thomas seemed to accept this, turning back to his book. "So, what did I miss on the essay assignment?" They spent the next 20 minutes reviewing requirements and deadlines, creating a manageable schedule for Thomas to catch up without becoming overwhelmed. As they worked, Eleanor noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. He sat straighter, made eye contact more frequently, asked questions when he didn't understand. Small shifts that signaled growing confidence. When other students began filtering into the classroom, Thomas returned to his regular seat, but not before saying quietly, "Thanks, Ms. Webb." During class discussion, Eleanor observed another unexpected development. When she asked for thoughts on Atticus Finch's moral courage, Thomas raised his hand, something he'd rarely done before his absence. "Courage isn't about being fearless," he said, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "It's about doing what's right even when you're afraid, even when it would be easier not to." The classroom fell silent. Thomas Parker, the quiet student who barely participated, had just articulated one of the novel's central themes with surprising eloquence. "Excellent point, Thomas," Eleanor acknowledged. "Can anyone build on that?" Zoe Chen, one of the more academically engaged students, turned in her seat to face Thomas. "I agree, and I think Scout learns that from watching her father. She sees that real courage is quiet and consistent, not showy." Thomas nodded. "Yeah, exactly. It's not about being dramatic. It's about showing up every day and doing what needs to be done, even when nobody notices or cares." The discussion continued, but Eleanor noticed something significant. Other students were now directing their comments to Thomas as well as to her, incorporating him into the intellectual community of the classroom in a way that hadn't happened. After class, as students filed out for lunch, Thomas lingered behind. "Is it still okay if I stay here to work?" he asked. "Of course," Eleanor replied. "I'll be here grading papers if you have questions." They worked in companionable silence for a while, until Thomas spoke again. "Things at home aren't going to get better anytime soon," he said, eyes fixed on his notebook. "Dad's drinking more since losing his job. Mom's working double shifts at the hospital cafeteria." Eleanor set down her red pen. "That sounds incredibly difficult, Thomas. I used to think dropping out was my only option. Get a job, help with bills." He tapped his pencil against the desk. "But then I'd just be stuck in the same cycle, wouldn't I?" "Education can be a way to break cycles," Eleanor said carefully. "But that doesn't make your current situation any easier to bear." Thomas nodded. "I was thinking, maybe I could tutor some of the freshmen after school. The counselor mentioned there's a stipend for peer tutors. Not much, but it might help at home without interfering with my own classes." Eleanor felt a rush of admiration for this young man, carrying adult burdens yet finding constructive solutions. "That's an excellent idea. I can recommend you to the program coordinator." Their conversation was interrupted by Sam Winters appearing in the doorway. "Webb, got a minute?" His eyes shifted to Thomas, then back to Eleanor with raised eyebrows. "Mr. Parker is working on makeup assignments," Eleanor explained. "Thomas, I'll be right back." In the hallway, Sam's expression was skeptical. Parker's back in school, I see. Didn't expect that to last. He's catching up quickly, Eleanor said evenly, and contributing thoughtfully to class discussions. Sam shrugged. If you say so, just don't invest too much hope there. Kids from situations like his rarely break the pattern. Eleanor felt a flash of irritation. Perhaps that's because too few people expect them to. Sam studied her for a moment. You know, Webb, after 29 years teaching, I've learned to conserve my energy for battles I can win. And I've learned, Eleanor replied quietly, that sometimes the students who need us most are the ones everyone else has given up on. Sam had no response to that, merely shaking his head slightly before continuing down the hallway. When Eleanor returned to the classroom, Thomas was bent over, his essay writing with newfound determination. Something had shifted, not just for Thomas but for Eleanor herself. In standing up for his potential to Sam, she'd also affirmed her own professional purpose, a purpose no family dinner could diminish. Mid-semester parent-teacher conferences typically drew only the most engaged families, parents of high achievers checking on college prospects, or parents of struggling students seeking intervention. Eleanor had long ago adjusted her expectations, preparing for long stretches of empty chairs and catching up on grading between the handful of appointments. When she received her conference schedule sheet that morning, she initially thought there had been a mistake. Every single time slot was filled, a full day of back-to-back meetings. Eleanor stared at the printout in disbelief. Quite popular this semester, Principal Harrison commented, passing Eleanor's classroom. I've never seen a full schedule for these conferences. There must be some error, Eleanor said, showing Harrison the sheet. Harrison scanned the list of names. No error. Several parents specifically requested you, even though their children aren't in your classes. She raised an eyebrow. You've become something of a hot commodity, Eleanor. The first conference of the day explained everything. Thomas Parker's mother arrived precisely at 8 a.m., looking exhausted but determined, her nurse's aide uniform suggesting she'd come directly from a night shift. Mrs. Parker, thank you for coming, Eleanor greeted her. Thomas has been making excellent progress. Please, call me Lynn, she replied, settling into the chair across from Eleanor's desk. And I'm the one who should be thanking you. Thomas told me what you've done. Eleanor tilted her head questioningly. What I've done? The way you engaged with him. How you make literature relevant to real life. Lynn's eyes shone with emotion. He shared some of your discussions about resilience and moral courage. We've actually been talking about books at home for the first time since he was little. Eleanor smiled, pleased but still confused about the unusually full schedule. I'm glad to hear that. Thomas has valuable insights. He does, Lynn agreed. And he's not the only one benefiting from your methods. She leaned forward slightly. I mentioned your approach to Diane Jackson. Her daughter Zoe is in your class too. And to Robert Freeman at the hospital, whose son Max has been struggling. With motivation. Understanding dawned. You've been recommending me to other parents. Lynn nodded. Word spreads fast in a small town. Especially when someone's making a real difference. She glanced at her watch. I should let you prepare for your next appointment. Just wanted you to know that what you're doing matters. Not just to Thomas, but to a lot of families around here. Throughout the day, Eleanor met with parent after parent, many following a similar pattern. Some had children in her classes, others had heard about her approach and wanted advice. A father described using Eleanor's conflict resolution technique at home, diffusing tensions with his teenage daughter. A mother expressed gratitude for Eleanor's book recommendations that had reignited her son's interest in reading. During a brief lunch break, Sam Winters passed by Eleanor's classroom, noticing the line of parents waiting in the hallway. He paused, coffee mug in hand, and peered at her schedule. Full house? He remarked with surprise. What's going on? Eleanor shrugged slightly. Just connecting with families. Sam studied the waiting parents. Huh, I've got 3 appointments. All day. Same as usual. He took a sip of coffee. Must be nice having the honor roll kids. Eleanor didn't correct his assumption. Sam wouldn't understand that many of these parents had children struggling with various challenges. They weren't coming to hear about perfect grades or exemplary behavior, but seeking partnership in helping their children navigate difficulties. By late afternoon, Eleanor's voice was growing hoarse from hours of conversation. But the energy in the room remained palpable as she welcomed her final appointment, an unexpected name on the schedule. Thomas Parker entered, accompanied not by his mother, but by a tall man with the same dark eyes and wary expression. He nodded stiffly to Eleanor. "Mr. Parker," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Eleanor Webb." "Jim Parker," he replied, his handshake brief but firm. "Thomas said I should come." Eleanor gestured for them to sit, noting the tense body language between father and son. The man's eyes were bloodshot, his hands slightly unsteady, signs that confirmed Thomas's comments about his drinking. "I appreciate you making time," Eleanor began carefully. "Thomas has been doing exceptional work lately." "Jim." Parker shifted uncomfortably. "Lynn mentioned that. Said he's talking about college now." Eleanor nodded. "He has significant potential. His analysis of complex themes shows remarkable insight. Always been smart," Jim acknowledged gruffly. "Gets that from his mother." "He also shows tremendous resilience," Eleanor added, watching the man's reaction. "An ability to persist through challenges that would defeat many adults." Something flickered across Jim Parker's face. Recognition, perhaps, or shame. He glanced at his son, who was studying the floor intently. "Thomas mentioned you're going through some difficult times." Eleanor continued gently. "I want you to know that school can be a stable environment for him while things at home stabilize." Jim's jaw tightened. "He shouldn't have—" "Dad," Thomas interrupted quietly. "Ms. Webb is trying to help." A heavy silence filled the room. Then, almost imperceptibly, Jim Parker nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Support his attendance," Eleanor said simply. "Encourage his studying. Ask about what he's reading." She paused. "And perhaps consider the resources the school counselor can recommend for the whole family." The man didn't respond immediately, pride clearly battling with necessity. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I'll think about it." It wasn't a promise, but it was a beginning. As father and son left the classroom, Eleanor noticed Thomas standing straighter beside his father, a new confidence in his bearing. Principal Harrison appeared in the doorway as Eleanor gathered her notes from the long day of conferences. "I've been hearing good things," Harrison said. "Very good things. We should talk tomorrow about expanding your approach." Eleanor nodded, too tired for further conversation, but filled with quiet satisfaction. For the first time in her career, she felt truly seen, not just by individual students, but by an entire community of families who recognized the value in her work. If only her own family could see her through these parents' eyes. Eleanor arranged the classroom desks in a circle for the literature discussion, a departure from the standard rows that faced the whiteboard. Today's topic, resilience in the face of societal pressure, would work better with students able to see one another. "Remember," she instructed as they settled into the new arrangement, "our goal today is to connect themes from the text to real-world experiences. Literature isn't just about analyzing what happened on the page. It's about understanding what happens in life." Thomas had arrived early again, claiming a seat that faced the window rather than the door, a small sign of increasing comfort in the classroom space. Eleanor noticed he'd brought a notebook filled with what appeared to be extensive notes on the reading. "Who would like to begin our discussion?" Eleanor asked once everyone was seated. The usual hands went up. Zoe Chen, always prepared. Michael Branson, the debate team captain. Lily Watkins, whose college applications emphasized her literary analysis skills. Eleanor was about to call on one of them when movement caught her eye. Thomas Parker had raised his hand. "Thomas," Eleanor acknowledged, masking her surprise. "Please share your thoughts." Thomas cleared his throat, glancing briefly at his notes before meeting the eyes of his classmates. "I've been thinking about how Scout and Jem faced the town's reaction to their father defending Tom Robinson. They could have just gone along with what everyone else thought. That would have been easier. But instead, they stand by Atticus, even when kids at school taunt them. He paused, gathering his thoughts. It made me wonder about when we choose the hard right over the easy wrong. Most of us have faced situations where doing the right thing means standing alone. The classroom fell silent. Thomas had never spoken this much at once, and certainly never with such conviction. Would you elaborate on that? Eleanor prompted gently. Thomas nodded, gaining confidence. There's this part where Scout wants to fight a classmate for insulting her father, but Atticus tells her sometimes courage is walking away. That really hit me because he hesitated, then pushed forward. Because sometimes what looks like giving up from the outside is actually taking the harder path. Zoe Chen turned in her seat to face Thomas directly. Like when Scout has to hold her temper at the tea party? Maintaining dignity while others are cruel? Exactly. Thomas agreed. It's not just physical courage that matters. Sometimes it's the courage to keep going when everything seems stacked against you. The discussion. Board at the back of the classroom remained blank, waiting for Eleanor to capture key insights as she usually did. But something told her to wait, to let the conversation develop organically among the students. I think about that with my parents, Lily Watkins said unexpectedly. They expect straight A's, perfect test scores. When I got a B+ in chemistry, last semester, my dad didn't speak to me for 3 days. She twisted a strand of hair nervously. Sometimes I wonder if it takes more courage to keep meeting their expectations or to choose my own path. Michael Branson, usually confident to the point of arrogance, nodded. My brother was supposed to take over our family business. When he decided to become a teacher instead, my parents acted like he'd betrayed them. But watching him do what he loves, even with their disapproval, that's real courage. Eleanor observed a remarkable transformation unfolding. Students who typically only engaged with the text were suddenly connecting literature to their lives, sharing vulnerabilities they'd never revealed in class before. In my culture, Zoe added, family expectations are everything. My grandmother still doesn't understand why I want to study environmental science instead of medicine. Sometimes standing up for your own dreams feels impossible. Thomas leaned forward slightly. But that's what makes it courage, right? If it were easy, everyone would do it. The discussion continued, weaving between textual analysis and personal reflection. Eleanor moved to the whiteboard, finally beginning to capture key points, but the students barely noticed. They were too engaged with each other. What about you, Ms. Webb? Thomas asked suddenly. Have you ever had to choose the harder path? The question caught Eleanor off guard. Teachers rarely became the subject of classroom discussions. I have, she admitted after a moment. Many times. Like becoming a teacher instead of something else? Thomas pressed, clearly thinking of their earlier private conversation. Eleanor considered her response carefully. Yes, I chose this path because I still believe, that helping young people find their voices matters deeply, even when others didn't see the value in that choice. She didn't elaborate on her family's dismissal, but Thomas's understanding nod suggested he'd connected the dots. The discussion continued until the bell rang, but several students lingered, reluctant to break the unusual energy that had developed in the room. Thomas approached Eleanor's desk as others filtered out. That was different, he said simply. Eleanor smiled. Yes, it was. Your contribution really opened up the conversation, Thomas. It felt good, he admitted. Like what I had to say actually mattered. It always matters, Eleanor assured him. Sometimes we just need the right space to express it. As Thomas left for his next class, Eleanor noticed the English department chair, William Foster, standing in the doorway. His expression suggested he'd been observing for some time. That, he said, gesturing to the now empty circle of desks, was remarkable. Eleanor began rearranging the room for her next class. The students did all the work. Not without the right environment, Foster countered. I've never seen engagement like that in a literature discussion. Even the students who usually stare at the clock were contributing. He stepped further into the classroom, examining the discussion board now filled with interconnected concepts. Harrison mentioned you've been developing some innovative approaches. I see she wasn't exaggerating. Eleanor felt a strange mixture of pride and discomfort at the recognition. I just try to make literature relevant to their lives. Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. Foster headed toward the door, then paused. The district curriculum committee has an opening. I think you should consider applying. As he left, Eleanor stood in the center of her classroom, taking in what had just occurred. A breakthrough had happened today, not just for Thomas or the other students, but perhaps for her as well. After 23 years of teaching in relative obscurity, people were suddenly noticing. She wondered, with a mixture of hope and skepticism, if her family would ever notice too. Eleanor was reviewing Thomas's latest essay when Principal Harrison appeared in her doorway after school, clutching a folder and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "Do you have a moment?" Harrison asked, already settling into a student desk. Eleanor set aside the essay. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "You are, actually." Harrison opened the folder. "I've been compiling some data. Since implementing your modified approach with Thomas Parker, his attendance has improved by 87%. His participation metrics have more than doubled, and his latest assessment scores show significant improvement." Eleanor nodded. "He's making wonderful progress. And he's not alone." Harrison laid out several graphs. "I took the liberty of tracking other students who've been struggling with engagement. Those in your classes are showing similar patterns of improvement. Not as dramatic as Thomas, perhaps, but statistically significant." Eleanor wasn't sure how to respond. She'd always focused on individual connections rather than quantifiable metrics. "Which brings me to this," Harrison continued, producing a notice for the staff bulletin board. "I'd like you to lead a professional development workshop at next week's faculty meeting. Share your approach with the entire staff." Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety. "Diane, I'm not sure that's necessary." "I disagree." Harrison's expression was determined. "Whatever you're doing is working, and other teachers should have the opportunity to learn from you." She placed the bulletin notice on Eleanor's desk. "You've been hiding your light under a bushel for too long, Eleanor." After Harrison left, Eleanor stared at the notice with mixed emotions. Eleanor Webb to present. Student-centered engagement strategies. The thought of presenting to her colleagues, some who'd dismissed her methods as idealistic or impractical, was daunting. She wasn't seeking the spotlight. She simply wanted to help her students. The next morning, Eleanor was arranging books. For her first period, when Sam Winters appeared in her classroom, coffee mug in hand. "Morning, Webb," he said, unusually subdued. "Got a minute?" Eleanor nodded, curious about his atypical morning visit. Sam glanced around to ensure they were alone. "Heard Harrison's got you presenting at the faculty meeting." "News travels fast," Eleanor remarked. "Small school." Sam took a sip of coffee. "Look, I wanted to ask you something. That Parker kid? I've noticed he's actually showing up regularly now, even participating in my class occasionally." "That's wonderful," Eleanor said sincerely. Sam shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, well, I'm not too proud to admit when I might have been wrong about a student." He cleared his throat. "I've got a similar situation with Ryan Martinez. Bright kid, terrible attendance. Home situation's a mess. I was thinking maybe whatever you did with Parker might work with him." Eleanor blinked in surprise. Sam Winters, admitting he might be wrong? Asking for her advice? This was unprecedented. In their years as colleagues, "I'd be happy to discuss it," she offered. "Perhaps after the faculty presentation." Sam nodded, his typical cynicism briefly replaced by something resembling hope. "I'd appreciate that." As he turned to leave, he added gruffly, "And Webb? I'll be listening at that presentation." Really listening. The week passed in a blur of preparation. Eleanor gathered materials, organized her thoughts, and tried to articulate methods that had become second nature over her years of teaching. She found herself staying late each evening, refining her approach. This wasn't just about Thomas Parker anymore. It was about potentially influencing how colleagues throughout the school engaged with struggling students. Thursday afternoon arrived too quickly. Eleanor stood at the front of the staff room, watching as teachers filed in for the mandatory meeting. Some looked interested, others appeared skeptical, A few checked emails on their phones. Principal Harrison nodded encouragingly from the back of the room. "Thank you all for coming," Eleanor began, then smiled slightly at her own formality. "Not that you had much choice." A ripple of appreciative laughter relaxed the atmosphere. "I'm not here to present revolutionary techniques or complex theories," she continued. "What I'd like to share are simple, practical approaches that have helped reconnect disengaged students with learning." She distributed handouts containing anonymous student testimonials, brief comments from Thomas and others about what had made a difference in their educational experience. "Notice what these students are saying," Eleanor highlighted. "They're not responding to innovative technology or specialized curriculum. They're responding to being seen, truly seen, as individuals with valuable thoughts and experiences." For the next 40 minutes, Eleanor outlined specific strategies, connecting literature themes to real-life challenges, creating discussion, spaces where personal insights were valued alongside textual analysis, using writing assignments as opportunities for authentic expression rather than just assessment. The key, she emphasized, is genuine interest in their perspectives. Students know the difference between perfunctory attention and authentic engagement. Throughout her presentation, Eleanor noticed a gradual shift in the room. Teachers who had initially seemed dismissive were taking notes. The science department head asked thoughtful questions about adapting literary discussion techniques for lab settings. Even the football coach wanted to know how Eleanor's approach might work with athletes struggling academically. Most surprising was Sam Winters, who remained attentive throughout, occasionally nodding in agreement. When Eleanor opened the floor for questions, he was among the first to raise his hand. "You mentioned creating safe spaces for authentic expression," he said. "What about students who use that as an opportunity to challenge authority or test boundaries?" It was a legitimate concern, not the dismissive comment Eleanor might have expected from him previously. "Authentic engagement doesn't mean abandoning structure or expectations," she replied. "If anything, students rise to higher standards when they feel their contributions are valued. The key is distinguishing between productive questioning and simple defiance." Sam nodded thoughtfully. "Makes sense." As the meeting concluded, teachers gathered around Eleanor with follow-up questions and requests for additional resources. "Principal," Harrison beamed from the sidelines, clearly pleased with the response. "Before you all leave," Harrison announced, "I'd like to share one more thing. I'm forming a teacher mentorship committee to expand these approaches across departments. Eleanor has agreed to chair this initiative." This was news to Eleanor, but she found herself nodding anyway. Something had shifted during her presentation, a recognition that her years of quiet work had produced insights worth sharing. "The bulletin board outside my office will have a sign-up sheet," Harrison continued. "Committee members will receive professional development credit and a small stipend." As teachers filtered out, many stopping to thank Eleanor personally, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. After 23 years of teaching largely in isolation, she suddenly found herself at the center of a professional community that valued her expertise. Sam Winters was the last to leave, pausing by Eleanor's desk. "Good stuff, Webb," he said. Simply, "Really good stuff." Coming from Sam, it was high praise indeed. Eleanor stared at Principal Harrison in disbelief. "The school board meeting? You want me to present at the district school board meeting?" Harrison nodded, seemingly unaware of the anxiety her request had triggered. "They're discussing the new student retention initiative next week. I can't think of anyone better to explain the approach we've been developing. Diane, I'm comfortable with my students, even with faculty, but the school board is different. That's superintendents, district officials, and parents, teachers, community members," Harrison added. "People who need to hear about effective strategies from someone with classroom experience, not just administrators with theories." Eleanor twisted her hands in her lap. "What exactly would I need to present? An overview of your approach, some data on its effectiveness, and perhaps a case study or two. Anonymized, of course." Harrison pulled out a draft agenda. "You'd have 15 minutes, followed by Q&A. 15 minutes to justify 23 years of teaching philosophy." Eleanor sighed. "And this is mandatory?" Harrison's expression softened, It's not an order, Eleanor. It's an opportunity. Your methods are making a real difference for our students. The board needs to hear that from you directly. After Harrison left, Eleanor sat alone in her classroom, considering the request. Public speaking had never been her strength. She preferred the intimate setting of a classroom to formal presentations. But if this could help expand resources for struggling students, a knock on her open door interrupted her thoughts. Thomas Parker stood in the doorway, a folder in his hands. "Ms. Webb, do you have a minute? I wanted to show you something." Eleanor welcomed the distraction. "Of course. Come in." Thomas placed the folder on her desk and opened it to reveal a college brochure. "The guidance counselor gave me this. It's for the education program at State University." Eleanor examined the brochure with surprise. "You're thinking about becoming a teacher?" Thomas nodded, a mixture of determination and uncertainty on his face. "I keep thinking about our discussions, how you help us connect books to real life, how you saw something in me when I couldn't see it myself." He hesitated. "I'd like to do that for other kids someday." In that moment, Eleanor's decision about the school board presentation crystallized. If her approach had influenced even one student to consider education as a meaningful path, perhaps it deserved a wider audience. "Thomas," she said, "would you be willing to help me with something?" The following week arrived with unsettling swiftness. Eleanor sat in the district administration building's conference room, reviewing her notes while board members and administrators filed in. Principal Harrison had secured the meeting room early, allowing Eleanor time to set up her materials and calm her nerves. "Ready?" Harrison whispered as the superintendent called the meeting to order. Eleanor nodded, though ready hardly described the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. After brief preliminaries, Harrison introduced the Student Retention Initiative agenda item, then called Eleanor to the podium. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor faced the assembled board members, administrators, and community attendees. "Good evening. I'm Eleanor Webb, English teacher at Oakridge High School. I've been asked to share some insights about our approach to student engagement and retention." She began by outlining her philosophy, meeting students where they were, connecting curriculum to their lived experiences, creating classroom environments where authentic expression was valued. As she spoke, Eleanor found her nervousness giving way to the same passion that fueled her teaching. "The data supports what we've observed anecdotally," she continued, displaying the charts Harrison had prepared. "When students feel genuinely seen and heard, attendance improves, participation increases, assessment scores rise. But perhaps most importantly, students develop intrinsic motivation rather than merely responding to external rewards or punishments." Eleanor was about to transition to her conclusion when a movement at the back of the room caught her attention. Thomas Parker had arrived with his mother and several other students from Eleanor's classes, slipping quietly into seats along the wall. Thomas gave her a subtle thumbs up. Drawing strength from their presence, Eleanor continued with renewed confidence. "Rather than simply telling you about our approach, I'd like to show you its impact. With permission from the students and their parents, I've invited several participants in our program to speak briefly about their experiences. This wasn't part of the original agenda, but Harrison had helped arrange it after Eleanor suggested, including student voices." Thomas approached the podium first, visibly nervous but determined. "My name is Thomas Parker," he began, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort with public speaking. 6 weeks ago, I was planning to drop out of school. My attendance was terrible, my grades were slipping, and I didn't see the point in continuing." The room fell silent, board members leaning forward slightly. "What changed for me wasn't a new program or stricter rules. It was having a teacher who showed me that education could be relevant to my life. Ms. Webb helped me see that the themes we discuss in literature, courage, resilience, integrity, aren't just words on a page. They're tools for navigating real challenges." Thomas glanced at Eleanor before continuing. "I'm now applying to college, planning to become a teacher myself. That wouldn't have happened without Ms. Webb's approach." 3 other students followed, each sharing similar stories of reconnection with learning. A parent spoke about observing positive changes at home, Even Sam Winters made a brief statement about implementing Eleanor's strategies with encouraging, early results. When Eleanor returned to the podium for her conclusion, the atmosphere in the room had transformed. Board members who had appeared distracted or skeptical were now engaged and attentive. "What we're proposing," Eleanor summarized, "is not an expensive new curriculum or complex intervention system. We're suggesting a return to the heart of education, meaningful connection between teachers, students, and subject matter. The approach is adaptable across grade levels and subjects, requiring primarily a shift in perspective rather than additional resources." During the Q&A session that followed, board members asked thoughtful questions about implementation and scalability. The superintendent inquired about training requirements. A parent on the board wondered about measuring long-term outcomes. Eleanor answered each question honestly, acknowledging limitations while emphasizing possibilities. As the discussion concluded, the board chair thanked her for the presentation. "This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking our district needs," she said. "I believe I speak for the entire board when I say we're interested in expanding this initiative with appropriate resources." Murmurs of agreement circulated through the room. Eleanor returned to her seat, suddenly aware of how tightly she'd been gripping her notes. "Well done," Harrison whispered. "Really well done." As the meeting moved to other agenda items, Eleanor noticed a reporter from the local newspaper scribbling notes in the back row. The quiet work she'd been doing for decades was about to become considerably less quiet. The article appeared in Thursday's edition of the Oakridge Gazette, complete with a photograph of Eleanor addressing the school board. "Innovative teacher. Transforms student outcomes," read the headline, followed by a detailed account of Eleanor's presentation and the board's enthusiastic response. The reporter had interviewed Thomas and several other students afterward, capturing their stories of educational transformation. Eleanor had skimmed the article with a mixture of pride and embarrassment before tucking the newspaper into her bag. She wasn't accustomed to public recognition and found the attention somewhat uncomfortable. By noon, her classroom had become a revolving door of colleagues offering congratulations. Even the superintendent had called to express his appreciation for her exemplary representation of the district's values. Eleanor was grading papers during her lunch break when her cell phone rang, her brother Richard's name appearing on the screen. They rarely spoke outside of family dinners. Eleanor answered with surprise and a touch of wariness. "Richard?" "Eleanor." His voice carried its usual crisp, professional tone. "I just saw the article in the Gazette. Why didn't you mention any of this at dinner on Sunday?" Eleanor set down her red pen. It didn't seem relevant to the conversation. "Not relevant?" Richard sounded genuinely perplexed. "Eleanor, you're featured in the newspaper for educational innovation. That's certainly more relevant than Catherine's endless surgical anecdotes." Eleanor wasn't sure how to respond. In 23 years of teaching, her professional accomplishments had never been deemed worthy of discussion at family gatherings. "Well," she said finally, "it's just part of my job." "Part of your job?" Richard repeated slowly. "Listen, I think we should discuss this further. Are you free for dinner tomorrow? Just the two of us? I have papers to grade." "Saturday, then. Dad's insisting we all come to dinner anyway. He specifically mentioned wanting to talk to you." "Oh." Flutter of anxiety settled in Eleanor's stomach. "Did he say why?" "Just that he saw the article. Mom's already framed it, apparently." Eleanor nearly dropped the phone. "She's what?" "Framed it. You know how she is with newspaper mentions. Remember when Catherine made that medical journal and Mom had it professionally mounted?" Richard paused. "Look, I should get back to my meeting." "But Eleanor, this is good work you're doing, really good work." The call ended, leaving Eleanor staring at her phone in disbelief. 23 years of teaching, and this was the first time her brother had acknowledged her career as good work. Saturday evening arrived with uncomfortable swiftness. Eleanor stood on her parents' doorstep once again, this time empty-handed. She'd been too distracted to bake her usual contribution. Her mother opened the door, beaming with an enthusiasm that immediately put Eleanor on guard. "There she is!" Martha exclaimed, pulling Eleanor into an uncharacteristically tight embrace. "Our local celebrity! Eleanor extricated herself gently. Hardly a celebrity, Mom. Nonsense. Front page of the Gazette. Come in, come in. I've got something to show you. Martha led Eleanor to the formal living room, where a newly framed newspaper article hung prominently beside her father's business awards. Seeing her photograph and name displayed alongside the family's treasured accomplishments was so surreal that Eleanor momentarily struggled to find words. Thank you, she managed finally. Your father nearly choked on his coffee when he saw it, Martha confided. Said he had no idea you were doing such important work at that school. Of course he didn't, Eleanor thought but didn't say. No one in the family had ever asked. Richard arrived next, accompanied by his wife Sandra, who immediately congratulated Eleanor on the article. Richard showed it to me right away, she said. We're so proud. Proud. The word struck Eleanor as both precious and painful. Had it really taken public recognition for her family to find pride in her work? Catherine arrived last, her customary punctuality abandoned. She embraced Eleanor with unusual warmth. Quite the accomplished educator, she said, a strange note in her voice that Eleanor couldn't quite identify. Dad hasn't stopped talking about it. Dinner began with an odd tension, conversations starting and stopping awkwardly until Jeremiah Webb cleared his throat. So, Eleanor, he said, setting down, his fork deliberately. This teaching method of yours, tell us about it. Eleanor nearly laughed at the absurdity. After decades of indifference toward her career, her father was suddenly interested in pedagogical approaches. It's not particularly complicated, she replied carefully. I focus on connecting literature to students' real-life experiences, creating spaces where they feel their perspectives are valued. And this is innovative? Jeremiah asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than his usual dismissiveness. Not new, exactly, Eleanor explained, but often overlooked in the push for standardized curriculum and test preparation. The results seem impressive, Richard interjected. That student they quoted, the one planning to become a teacher himself, that's quite an impact. Thomas, Eleanor supplied, a surge of warmth at the mention of her student. He's overcome significant obstacles. The superintendent was quoted calling your methods transformative, Catherine added. That's high praise from an administrator. Eleanor felt increasingly disoriented by her family's sudden interest. Yes, well, the district is considering implementing similar approaches more broadly. Always knew you had potential, her father declared, as if he'd been her champion all along. Webb intelligence showing through. The revisionist history was too much. 23 years of dismissive comments, of minimizing her career choice, of treating her work as inconsequential, and now her father claimed he'd always known her potential? Did you? Eleanor asked quietly. Jeremiah looked up from his plate, surprised by the challenge in her tone. Of course. You're my daughter. That's not how I remember it, Dad. Eleanor set down her silverware, her heart pounding. I remember being told I was wasting my potential by becoming a teacher. I remember being introduced as Eleanor, our daughter who teaches, while Richard was our son the attorney, and Catherine was our daughter the surgeon. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Martha looked distressed. Richard studied his plate, and Catherine shifted in her seat. Well, perhaps there were some misunderstandings, Jeremiah said stiffly. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. It was a fundamental devaluing of my chosen profession. And suddenly, because a newspaper article validates my work, you're all interested? Eleanor, dear, her mother began. I've been successful for years, Eleanor said firmly. You just measured by the wrong metrics. The silence that followed felt both terrible and necessary, a truth finally spoken after decades of polite acquiescence. The email from Oakridge Community Center arrived on Monday morning, buried among routine school announcements and department memos. Eleanor nearly overlooked it until she noticed the subject line. Request for Parent Education Workshop. Margaret Chen, the center's director and mother of Eleanor's student Zoe, was proposing a series of evening workshops for parents on supporting Student engagement at home. Your approach has made such a difference for my daughter, Margaret wrote. Many parents are asking how they can reinforce these strategies outside of school hours. Eleanor read the email twice, uncertain how to respond. Teaching students was her comfort zone. Instructing adults was another matter entirely. And after the tension of Saturday's family dinner, she felt emotionally drained. Before she could decide, Principal Harrison appeared in her doorway. "I see Margaret's reached out to you," she said, noticing the email on Eleanor's screen. "Excellent opportunity. I'm not sure, Diane. I've never conducted parent workshops before." "You presented to the school board beautifully," Harrison reminded her. "And these would be parents who specifically want your guidance. The community center isn't exactly part of my job description," Eleanor hedged. Harrison leaned against the doorframe. "True, but imagine the impact. Extending your approach beyond school walls into homes and families. The ripple effect could be significant." Eleanor recognized the strategic appeal in Harrison's voice. The principal was building her reputation as an educational innovator, with Eleanor's methods as the showcase example. Yet the idea held genuine merit despite the administrative agenda behind it. "I'll consider it," Eleanor conceded. By the end of the day, Eleanor had drafted a response to Margaret, agreeing to conduct a pilot workshop the following week. She envisioned a practical session, strategies parents could implement without special training, focused on creating meaningful conversations about learning. Word spread quickly through Oakridge's parent networks. When Eleanor arrived at the community center the following Tuesday evening, she was stunned to find the meeting room overflowing with attendees. Folding chairs had been added to accommodate the unexpected crowd, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. "We had to turn people away," Margaret whispered apologetically. "Fire code limits. We've scheduled a second session for Thursday to handle the overflow." Eleanor scanned the audience, recognizing parents of her current and former students mixed with unfamiliar faces. Thomas Parker sat near the front with his mother. "I'll be here in a minute." "Perfect timing," Eleanor replied, pouring coffee for both of them. "How are things at home?" Lynn's smile was cautious but genuine. "Better. Jim's been sober for 6 weeks now, attending meetings regularly. The family counseling has been challenging but helpful." "That's wonderful progress," Eleanor said sincerely, recalling the tense father-son dynamic she'd witnessed during parent-teacher conferences. "Much of it stemming from what's happened with Thomas," Lynn acknowledged. "Seeing him transform, becoming engaged and hopeful about his future, it's been a powerful motivator for all of us." Thomas entered then, carrying his backpack and a folder of his own. At 17, he still had the lankiness of adolescence, but his posture and demeanor had transformed over the past months, the defensive slouch replaced by quiet confidence. "Sorry I'm late," he said, settling into the third chair. "Mr. Reynolds needed help moving some equipment." "Always helping others," Lynn remarked with obvious pride. "He's been tutoring his sister with her reading, too." Thomas looked embarrassed, but pleased by his mother's comment. "Just using what I've learned here." Eleanor opened her folder, displaying Thomas's academic progress charts. "I wanted to start by showing you both the quantitative measures of Thomas's growth this year. His attendance has improved from 63% to 97% since January. His grade point average has risen from 1.8 to 3.7. His participation metrics in all classes, not just mine, show significant improvement." Lynn studied the charts, nodding. "His other teachers have mentioned the changes. Mr. Winters actually called, specifically to tell me how impressed he's been with Thomas's work in science lately." "Sam Winters called home with positive feedback?" Eleanor couldn't hide her surprise. The cynical science teacher rarely made such efforts. "Said Thomas helped another student understand a difficult concept when he couldn't explain it effectively," Lynn confirmed. "Mentioned something about Thomas having natural teaching instincts." Thomas ducked his head slightly, but Eleanor caught his small, pleased smile. "That brings us to the main purpose of today's meeting," Eleanor continued. "Thomas's future plans. We've been discussing possibilities throughout the semester." Thomas straightened in his chair, withdrawing several papers from his folder. I've been researching education programs at different colleges, he explained. To his mother, looking at requirements, costs, and scholarship opportunities. He laid out information sheets for 3 state universities, each annotated with his neat handwriting. This one has the strongest education program, but limited financial aid. This one offers special scholarships for future teachers who commit to working in underserved districts after graduation. And this one has a direct pathway from associate's degree to bachelor's, which might be most affordable. Lynn studied the materials, visibly moved by her son's thoroughness. You've really thought this through. Ms. Webb helped me understand the options, Thomas acknowledged. And Mr. Harrison in guidance provided information about application fee waivers and financial aid. Several universities have programs specifically designed to attract students interested in teaching shortage areas, Eleanor added. Thomas's interest in working with at-risk students makes him an excellent candidate. The application deadlines are this fall, Thomas continued. I've already started drafting my personal statement. He hesitated, then slid a printed essay across the table to Eleanor. Would you be willing to review it? Eleanor accepted the document, titled, The Teacher Who Saw Me, How Literature Saved My Education. A quick scan of the introduction revealed Thomas's eloquent description of his near dropout experience and the literature discussions that had reconnected him with learning. I'd be honored to review it, she said, genuinely touched. Though from this introduction it seems quite powerful already. Lynn wiped at her eyes discreetly. I never thought we'd be having this conversation 6 months ago. College seemed impossible, with our financial situation, and Thomas was so close to giving up. Things can change quickly with the right support, Eleanor observed. And Thomas has done all the real work himself. Not by myself, Thomas corrected quietly. You showed me a path when I couldn't see one. He reached into his backpack and removed an envelope. I received this yesterday, wanted to save it for this meeting. The envelope bore the official seal of State University. Eleanor and Lynn watched as Thomas carefully opened it and removed a formal letter. Dear Mr. Parker, he read, his voice steady despite the emotion visible on his face. We are pleased to inform you that based on your exceptional academic improvement, compelling personal circumstances, and outstanding recommendation from your literature teacher, you have been selected as a preliminary candidate for our Future Educators Scholarship Program. Lynn gasped, reaching for her son's hand. This early notification is provided to allow promising candidates additional preparation time. Formal applications will be accepted beginning September 1st, with final selections announced in December. The scholarship covers full tuition and partial living expenses for qualified students committed to careers in education. Thomas looked up, his expression a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. It's not a guarantee, but it's a real chance. A very real chance, Eleanor confirmed. The Future Educators program is highly selective, but they specifically seek students who understand educational challenges from personal experience. My son, Lynn whispered, pride evident in her voice. A teacher. Thomas carefully returned the letter to its envelope. If I'm accepted, I'd like to focus on literature and working with students who've struggled like I did. He looked directly at Eleanor. Would you be willing to mentor me through college and maybe even when I start teaching? Help me develop the kind of approach you use? The request represented a continuation of Eleanor's influence beyond her classroom, an extension of her methods through a new generation of educators. In Thomas, she saw not just a successful student, but a potential colleague who understood firsthand the power of authentic engagement. I'd be honored, she replied simply. Though I suspect you'll develop your own powerful approaches based on your experiences. As they continued discussing practical steps for the coming months, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From a disengaged student on the verge of dropping out to a young man with clear purpose and direction, Thomas's transformation embodied everything she had always believed about education's potential to change lives. And it had started with a letter. A simple expression of gratitude that had initiated ripples of change extending far beyond what either of them could have imagined. The school auditorium buzzed with anticipation on the evening of the district's annual achievement ceremony. Teachers in formal attire mingled with administrators, board members, and honored students near the stage, while families filled the seats, programs in hand. Eleanor sat in the front row, uncharacteristically nervous. Her navy dress, purchased specifically for this occasion at Catherine's insistence, felt foreign compared to her usual classroom attire. Principal Harrison had been deliberately vague about the evening's agenda, saying only that Eleanor's presence was absolutely essential. In the row behind her sat her entire family, her parents, Richard and his wife, with their son Brandon, Catherine in a rare evening away from hospital responsibilities. Their collective presence at a school function felt surreal after decades of their disinterest in her professional world. Nervous? Richard leaned forward to ask. Unnecessarily so, Eleanor admitted. I'm more comfortable with 30 teenagers than formal ceremonies. You deserve this recognition, he replied with conviction unfamiliar from her typically competitive brother. Before Eleanor could respond, Superintendent Morris approached the podium, signaling the beginning of the ceremony. After standard acknowledgments and minor awards, the superintendent's tone shifted to something more ceremonial. Our final presentation this evening is our most significant, the District Teacher of the Year Award. This honor recognizes not just classroom excellence, but transformative impact on students, colleagues, and our educational community. Eleanor's attention drifted slightly as he outlined the selection criteria. She was curious about which of her colleagues would receive the honor. Perhaps Diane Marshall from the science department, whose innovative lab programs had gained regional attention. This year's recipient, the superintendent continued, has demonstrated that the most powerful educational innovation often comes not from technology or curriculum packages, but from the fundamental human connection between teacher and student. A strange hush fell over Eleanor's colleagues nearby, several glancing in her direction with knowing smiles. Through student-centered engagement strategies, this educator has dramatically improved retention rates among our most vulnerable students. Their approach has been adopted across departments in our district and is now being considered for statewide implementation. Understanding dawned slowly. The superintendent was describing her work. Before announcing the recipient, we have a special introduction from a student whose educational journey exemplifies the impact of this teacher's methods. Thomas Parker appeared from the wings, looking simultaneously nervous and determined in a borrowed suit jacket. He approached the podium with the confidence of someone who had found his voice. "Good evening," he began, his steady tone belying the slight tremor in his hands. "My name is Thomas Parker. 6 months ago I was planning to drop out of school. Today I'm preparing for college with plans to become an educator myself. This transformation didn't happen by accident." Thomas looked directly at Eleanor as he continued. "It happened because one teacher refused to see me as just another statistic. Ms. Eleanor Webb created a classroom where my thoughts mattered, where literature connected to real life, where I discovered my own capacity for growth and contribution." From the audience, Eleanor saw her father listening with unusual attentiveness, her mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Ms. Webb doesn't just teach literature," Thomas continued. "She teaches students to find their voices, to persist through challenges, to recognize their own potential. She's been doing this quietly, consistently, for 23 years, changing lives like mine without seeking recognition or acclaim." His genuine emotion resonated through the auditorium, creating a reverent silence. The measurement of a great teacher isn't found in test scores or accolades, but in the lives they transform. By that metric, Ms. Webb may be the most successful person I've ever known. The audience erupted in applause as Thomas concluded. "It's my honor to introduce this year's District Teacher of the Year, Ms. Eleanor Webb." Standing on shaky legs, Eleanor made her way to the podium amid a standing ovation. Thomas embraced her briefly before returning to his seat beside his beaming mother and proudly sober father. "Thank you," Eleanor began, once the applause subsided. "This recognition is deeply meaningful, though the true reward of teaching has always been watching students discover their capabilities." She spoke briefly about her educational philosophy, acknowledging mentors who had shaped her approach and colleagues who had supported her methods. Teaching is never a solitary endeavor, she emphasized. Every educator in this room contributes to the collective impact we have on students' lives. As she concluded her remarks, Eleanor noticed her family in the audience. Her mother openly emotional, her father sitting straighter with unmistakable pride, her siblings applauding with genuine enthusiasm. The family that had spent decades subtly dismissing her career was now witnessing its value through others' eyes. After the ceremony, they gathered at an upscale restaurant Catherine had selected for celebration. The conversation flowed with unprecedented ease, focused primarily on Eleanor's work and future educational initiatives. To Eleanor, her father proposed, raising his glass in a toast that would have been unimaginable months earlier, whose dedication to meaningful work reminds us all to measure success by lives touched rather than titles acquired. Later, as dessert was served, Thomas appeared at their table, stopping by after his own family celebration. "Ms. Webb," he said, "I wanted to share some news. I've been offered a full scholarship to the education program." His expression was radiant with possibility. "I start next fall." "Congratulations," Eleanor replied warmly. "You've earned this opportunity." After Thomas departed, Catherine looked thoughtful. "You've found your purpose and pursued it regardless of external validation. I'm only now learning to do the same." "It's never too late," Eleanor assured her. As the evening concluded and they stepped into the mild spring night, Eleanor's father walked beside her toward the parking area. "I've been wrong about many things," he said quietly. "Your choice of career chief among them." Eleanor glanced at her father, noting the emotional openness unusual for him. "We all find different paths to meaningful contribution, Dad. Some more directly than others," he acknowledged. "I built business empires. You build human potential. I'm beginning to understand which has more lasting value." The following Monday, Eleanor stood at her classroom window watching students arrive for the final weeks of the school year. The familiar yellow buses, the flow of teenagers with backpacks and morning conversations, the rhythms of school life that had structured her days for 23 years, all seemed both unchanged and entirely different. Thomas approached her doorway. "Morning, Ms. Webb. Ready for another day of changing lives?" Eleanor smiled at his gentle teasing. "One conversation at a time," she replied. "That's all we ever do." As students began filing in for first period, Eleanor moved from the window to welcome them. Whatever external recognition might come, the true measure of her work would always be here, in the daily connections, the moments of understanding, the quiet transformations that rippled outward in ways no award could capture.